Victoria Sterling was standing on his porch when Ethan Carter returned to Eagle Creek Valley after nearly a year away. Not as a guest, not as a neighbor who had wandered over to check on things. She stood there, the way a person stands on ground they believe belongs to them, weight settled, chin lifted, one hand resting on the wooden railing his grandfather had built with a hand plane and a level and a patience that no longer existed in the modern world. Two contractors moved along the far side of the lodge with measuring tape and clipboards, their orange vests bright against the gray morning. The lock on the front door was new. The gate at the foot of the gravel path bore a laminated notice in a plastic sleeve, and even from 20 feet away, Ethan could read the words Sterling Heights Community Association printed across the top in clean corporate lettering. He had driven 9 hours through a December that couldn't decide between rain and sleet. The mountain passed slick enough that he'd dropped to second gear for the last 30 miles, and now he stood in his own driveway watching a woman he had met exactly twice treat his family's land like a renovation project she'd already closed on. The valley had looked the way it always looked in the deep, cold Silver Pine Lake flat and pewter-colored under a sky the same shade as old concrete, the tree line on the far ridge draped in fog so thick it swallowed the tops of the Douglas firs and left only their dark trunks visible like columns holding up a ceiling of cloud. Ethan had rolled the window down on the last stretch of road just to smell it. Pine resin and cold water and the particular mineral sharpness of mountain air after a week of rain. He had been gone longer than he intended. A consulting assignment in Portland that stretched from 3 months to 9, a sublease that turned into something more complicated, a series of decisions that felt reasonable one at a time and unreasonable only when you looked at them together. Eagle Creek Valley had existed in the back of his mind the whole time the way a house key exists in your pocket. You don't think about it until you reach for it. He had reached for it now. Victoria Sterling was the thing his fingers found instead. She smiled when he approached. That was the first thing to understand about her. The smile came first always, and it was a very good smile. The kind that had been maintained and deployed for long enough that it no longer required conscious effort. She extended her hand. "Mr. Carter," she said in a tone that suggested she was pleasantly surprised and had also been expecting him both at once. "I'm glad you finally come by." Ethan shook her hand and looked past her at the contractors who had paused their measuring. He asked what was happening to his door. Victoria explained in the smooth and unhurried way of someone reciting a policy they helped write that the Sterling Heights Community Association had filed a formal notice of abandoned property status with the county assessor's office 4 months prior, that the lodge had been vacant, unheated, and unmonitored for the better part of a year. That the association, acting in the interest of community safety and property value, had taken over management of the structure under the HOA's emergency stewardship provisions. Ethan listened to all of this without interrupting. The fog off the lake had drifted up the slope and was moving through the pines below the lodge, now slow and deliberate the way fog always moved through that particular stand of trees. He had watched it do the same thing every morning of every autumn he had ever spent here, going back to when he was 8 years old, and his grandfather would wake him before sunrise to go look at the water. He asked about the contractors. Victoria said they were conducting a structural assessment. Standard procedure, she told him, when a property had been deemed unoccupied for an extended period. Ethan asked who had authorized the assessment. Victoria said the association board. He asked when the board had acquired the authority to authorize work on privately deeded land. She smiled again. "The stewardship provisions are quite clear," she said. One of the contractors had resumed measuring. Ethan walked to the gate at the foot of the path and examined the laminated notice more carefully. Sterling Heights Community Association, Temporary Property Stewardship, authorized under Article 7, Section 4 of the Community Governance Charter. Below that, in smaller print, this property has been designated as abandoned per county ordinance. Current status pending community review. And beneath the notice, someone had zip-tied a small white sign to the gatepost. Private, community, property. Keep out. Ethan stood there for a long moment looking at those 3 words on a sign fastened to a gate that his grandfather had set in concrete 40 years ago, on land that the Carter family had owned continuously since 1951. He turned back toward the porch. Victoria was still smiling. She genuinely believed he realized then that she had already won. The diner at the edge of the valley's single main street was called Pine Cone Breakfast, which had always seemed to Ethan like a name that had been picked by throwing darts at a list of mountain-adjacent words. But the coffee was strong, and the owner, a wiry man in his 60s named Gerald, had known Ethan's father and treated the Carter family the way people in small towns treat old families, with the particular combination of familiarity and respect that comes from shared history rather than personal closeness. Or at least, that was how it had been. When Ethan pushed through the door that morning, the room did a subtle thing that he had never experienced there before. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They simply recalibrated. Eyes moved toward him and then away, too quickly. Gerald came out from behind the counter and refilled a coffee cup at the far end of the room that probably didn't need refilling, and then wiped a section of counter that was already clean, and then disappeared briefly through the kitchen door and came back without having retrieved anything. A woman Ethan recognized as a county commissioner's assistant studied her phone with unusual intensity. A table of 4 near the window found reasons to look out at the parking lot. The warmth he had always associated with this room, the steam rising from the pie case, the smell of bacon fat and birchwood burning somewhere in the back, the ease of being in a place where you had been known for a long time was still physically present. But it had been drained of its social meaning, replaced by the particular discomfort of a community that has been told a version of events and is now confronted with the person that version was built around. He took a stool at the counter. Gerald came back eventually, the way a man comes back when he has decided that avoidance is itself a statement, and he would rather not make one. He poured Ethan a coffee without being asked. Ethan asked him what was going on. Gerald wiped the counter with a cloth, a gesture that bought him 4 seconds of not answering. Then he told Ethan that Victoria Sterling had spent the last several months making a very thorough case to the residents of Eagle Creek Valley that the Carter Lodge had been permanently abandoned, that the family had moved on, that the property was for all practical purposes a liability rather than an asset, and that the HOA was the responsible party to address it. Gerald said this without embellishment, reporting the facts of a situation he hadn't created and wasn't sure he endorsed. Ethan asked what people had said. Gerald refilled his own coffee even though he hadn't taken a sip from it. People had mostly believed her, he said. She had documentation. She had a presentation. She had a county assessor's preliminary report that used the word abandoned 3 times in 2 paragraphs. People in small communities, Gerald said carefully, tend to believe the person with the most organized paperwork. Ethan found the brochure on the counter near the register, which was either accidental or a very specific kind of social commentary on Gerald's part. It was a glossy trifold, the kind that costs more to print than most people realize, with the words Eagle Creek, a premier mountain community embossed on the front, and photographs of a lake that looked like Silver Pine Lake, but had been rendered in the particular saturated blue that only exists in real estate marketing materials. He opened it. A marina. Luxury villas on the eastern shore, a central promenade lined with boutique retail, a grand residential cluster on the high ground above the water, which was the exact position currently occupied by the Carter family lodge. He studied the rendering for a long time. The lodge wasn't demolished in the image, it simply didn't exist. The land where it had stood for more than 70 years had been smoothed into a gentle hill with a decorative path winding through it, and at the top of that hill, someone had placed a rendering of a glass and steel pavilion that bore no relationship to anything that had ever existed in this valley. A man at the table behind him, someone Ethan didn't recognize, newer to the valley, he guessed one of the arrivals from the past few years, leaned over and said he was a property consultant and that whatever Ethan was planning to do, he should probably talk to Victoria Sterling before things got worse. Ethan looked at the brochure again, at the pavilion, at the marina, at the blue water that had replaced the gray water he had driven 9 hours to see. This was not about a homeowners association with an overactive governance charter. This was something larger and older and more precisely calculated than that. And whatever it was, it had been built specifically around the assumption that Ethan Carter was not coming back. He walked back to the lodge the long way along the lakeshore trail that ran through the pines before cutting uphill through the meadow. The fog had thickened while he was at the diner, and the lake was barely visible now, just a darker gray. Beneath a lighter one, the sound of water moving against the rocks at the shore's edge more present than the water itself. He could hear wind moving through the high branches above him and farther off the sound of a vehicle somewhere on the access road. The gate at the lodge entrance was chained now. Someone had added a combination lock while he was gone. Ethan climbed through the fence at the gap near the old fence post that had been leaning at 45 degrees since the spring. His cousin had backed a truck into it, a gap every member of the Carter family knew about and no one had ever gotten around to fixing, and he walked up the path toward the front door. The lodge was lit from inside. He could see it through the windows before he reached the porch, warm light the kind produced by the portable halogen lamps used at real estate showings, and he could hear voices low and conversational, the ambient sound of people moving through a space with drinks in hand. He stood at the front door for a moment, his hand on the new lock, and then he simply pushed the door and discovered that whoever had changed the lock had not bothered to actually engage it, which was the kind of detail that told him something about how confident Victoria Sterling was that no one would come back to check. He pushed the door open and walked inside. There were 11 people in his living room. 8 of them held wine glasses, 2 held brochures. One held what appeared to be a site plan folded into quarters, which he was consulting with the focused expression of a man who had invested significant money in something he was trying very hard to still believe in. Victoria stood near the fireplace, which was not his fireplace, or rather it was the same stone hearth his grandfather had built, but it had been arranged with candles and architectural sample books as if it were a staging prop. She was mid-sentence when Ethan came through the door describing sightlines from the proposed villa terrace, and she paused without losing her composure in any way that was visible to the room, which was itself a kind of professional achievement. One of the men near the window, tall in his 50s, the kind of expensive casual clothing that people wear when they want to look like they aren't trying, asked who Ethan was. Victoria said in the smooth and unflinching register she used for everything that Ethan was a previous occupant of the property who had expressed occasional interest in the area. Ethan looked at her. He said he was the owner. The man near the window looked at Victoria. Victoria maintained her expression with the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed for exactly this moment while also visibly hoping it would not arrive. She began to speak about the county's administrative process for abandoned properties. One of the other investors, a woman in a gray blazer who had the particular focus of someone who had not built her career on taking other people's word for things, put down her brochure and asked directly what was the ownership status of the land on which the current structure stood. Victoria said the situation was being resolved through proper channels. The woman in the gray blazer looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Victoria. The halogen lamps hummed. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. In the particular silence that followed, the doubt in the room was not a small thing. It was structural. The investors were looking at a woman who had just described the primary landowner as a previous occupant, and they were doing the math, and the math was not producing the number she needed it to produce. Then Ethan's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code was local. He excused himself and stepped onto the porch. The wind was cold and the fog had settled completely over the lake. He answered. The man on the other end said his name was Samuel Reed. He said he thought they should talk before the end of the week and that he had documents Ethan needed to see. He said he worked for the county planning department. He said he had been watching this situation develop for several months and had reached the point where staying quiet was no longer something he was comfortable with. Ethan asked where and when. Samuel gave him an address in the county seat 30 miles east and a time the following morning. He said to park on the side street and come through the building's secondary entrance. Ethan said he'd be there. He stood on the porch for a minute after he hung up, looking out at the place where the lake should have been. The fog had eaten it entirely. He could hear it, though the water, the old familiar sound of Silver Pine Lake in cold weather, low and continuous and indifferent to whatever was happening on its shores. The county records building was a low structure that smelled of old paper and the particular variety of climate control that is perpetually losing its argument with the building it's installed in. He had parked on the side street as Samuel had asked and come through a door marked Staff Only. At the building's eastern end, following a hallway of beige linoleum past a row of metal filing cabinets and a bulletin board bearing notices about parking validation procedures, into a small room off the main archive where Samuel Reed was already waiting. Samuel was a man in his mid-40s with the slightly worn appearance of someone who had spent too many years watching things go wrong and documenting them carefully. There were the small signs of it, the way he sat, the particular economy of his movements, the habit he had of not speaking until he was certain the other person was ready to listen. He had a folder on the table, and a second folder beneath the first one, and a third folder beneath that, and he slid them across to Ethan in sequence, the way a person presents evidence when they have been waiting a long time for someone to present it to. The room was very quiet. The fluorescent tube overhead was a few watts short of its rated output and gave everything a slightly cooler cast than the room deserved. Outside, the wind moved in the bare trees along the parking lot. Ethan sat down and opened the first folder. The first document was a Planning Commission internal memo from 14 months prior, marked for limited distribution. It outlined a proposed corridor acquisition strategy for what the memo called the Eastern Valley Transit Connection, a road that, if completed, would link the proposed resort development at Silver Pine Lake to the regional highway 40 miles north, bypassing 3 existing bottlenecks and cutting transit time by roughly 40 minutes. The document included a map. The proposed corridor ran directly through the eastern quarter of Carter family land. Ethan studied the map for a long time. Samuel pointed to a section in the second folder, a series of internal communications between the Sterling Heights Development Group and a county assessor's deputy. The communications referenced in language that was careful enough to not be explicit but specific enough to not be accidental, a strategy for establishing property abandonment designations on targeted parcels. The word targeted appeared twice. The phrase timeline for administrative action appeared 3 times. Ethan read every page. The third folder was the most important. It was a set of easement records going back to 1953, cross-referenced with current zoning maps. Samuel walked him through it slowly. The Eastern Valley Transit Corridor, he explained the road that the entire resort project depended on, the road that made the marina and the villas and the glass pavilion commercially viable rather than just architecturally ambitious, could not be built without crossing Carter land at 2 specific points, not rerouted around it, not tunneled under it. The topography of the valley made those 2 crossings the only viable option. Every engineer who had looked at the project knew this. Every planner who had signed off on the concept had done so with the assumption that the Carter land issue would be resolved prior to groundbreaking. The assumption had been that it would be resolved through an abandonment designation, which would transfer effective control to the county, which would then grant an easement to the development group. The assumption had been that Ethan Carter was not coming back. Samuel closed the last folder. He said the county had already received the reservoir expansion approval, a federal infrastructure project that would significantly increase the value of the surrounding watershed land, meaning Eagle Creek Valley property values were about to move in a direction that made everything happening here considerably more consequential than it would have been a year ago. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He thanked Samuel. Samuel said he appreciated it, but that thanks wasn't really what he was after. He said what he was after was someone in the right position to make the right information public at the right time. He looked at Ethan the way people look at someone they've made a considered decision to trust. Ethan drove back to the valley through midday fog, a different quality of fog than the morning kind, thicker, more settled, the kind that parks itself between the ridges and declines to move for hours at a stretch that absorbs sound and compresses distance and makes a valley feel complete and self-contained, insulated from the world beyond the ridgeline in a way that could feel like either isolation or shelter depending on what you were returning to. On the radio, there was weather news about a front coming in from the coast, the kind of sustained December rain that the mountains turned to sleet somewhere above 4,000 feet. He thought about his grandfather building the lodge. He had heard the story enough times that it existed in his memory as clearly as his own experiences the 2 years of weekend work. The timber sourced from the property itself, the foundation poured by hand because the site wasn't accessible to a concrete truck that first winter. His grandfather had been methodical about the land in a way that people from that generation were methodical, surveying every boundary, recording every document, treating ownership not as an asset to be leveraged, but as a responsibility to be managed and eventually passed on. The irony of Victoria Sterling's strategy was that it depended entirely on the assumption that the Carter family had evolved away from that relationship with the land, that the lodge was a legacy no one was particularly attached to, that the valley was simply waiting for someone more ambitious to claim it. 2 days after his conversation with Samuel, Ethan received a call from his insurance carrier asking about the current land use status of the Eagle Creek parcel. The caller said they had received an inquiry from a third party regarding an easement assessment and needed to confirm whether any land use agreements were currently in effect. Ethan confirmed no easements, no land use agreements, no stewardship transfers of any kind had been authorized. He was the sole authorized representative of the Carter Family Trust, and no document bearing his name or his family's name had been signed in connection with the Sterling Heights project in any capacity. He asked who had made the inquiry. The caller was not able to share that information. Ethan thanked her. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after he hung up, listening to the rain on the lodge roof. It had started in the night, the front from the coast arriving, as predicted. A steady and serious rain that ran down the old gutters and pooled in the low spot by the garden wall the way it always had. He heard at some point in the middle of that afternoon the sound of a vehicle on the access road. He looked out the window. The billboard he had noticed on the way in a large, full-color display mounted on a metal frame near the highway turnoff advertising Eagle Creek, a premier mountain community coming soon, was no longer visible. Either the fog had consumed it entirely or it had been removed. He suspected the latter. Victoria Sterling came to the lodge the following morning. She came alone, which was itself a change from the patterns Ethan had observed since his return, and she came without the smile arriving first the way it usually did. She was composed. She was dressed for the weather in a way that suggested she had dressed very carefully for it. But the composure had the quality of something maintained by effort rather than produced naturally. And the effort was visible in small ways. A tightness around the eyes, a precision in her movements that looked like the precision of someone monitoring themselves closely. She stood on the porch and Ethan opened the door and did not invite her in, which was itself a sentence in a language they had both now learned to speak. She told him that what he was doing was causing serious harm to the community, that the development project represented several years of planning and significant investment by people who had acted in good faith on the basis of the information available to them. She said that the value the project would bring to Eagle Creek Valley was real and measurable, and that Ethan's decision to obstruct it was a choice to prioritize his own interests over the well-being of dozens of families who had built their lives around this valley. Her voice was even throughout. She said it all the way. Someone reads a prepared statement, each sentence placed with care. There was something almost impressive about it, the ability to stand on someone else's porch and deliver a speech about community harm with the equanimity of a person who had never once considered that she might be the source of it. Ethan had met people like this before, though rarely in circumstances this specific. The particular quality of Victoria's confidence was not the confidence of someone who believed they were right. It was the confidence of someone who had spent long enough being effective that the distinction had ceased to matter to them. She had built something real. The project existed on paper, in renderings, in the commitments of investors who had trusted her word. She had done the work, that the foundation of the work had been built on ground she did not own, on a presumption she had manufactured rather than discovered, on the calculated absence of a person she had expected to stay. Absent none of that in her accounting seemed to diminish the scope of what she had assembled. Ethan understood this, and he found it neither sympathetic nor contemptible. It was simply clarifying. Ethan listened. When she finished, he asked her which county assessor's deputy had signed the abandonment designation on the Carter parcel. She said that was an administrative matter. He asked whether she was aware that the corridor acquisition strategy had been documented in internal planning memos more than 14 months prior. She said she wasn't sure what he was referring to. He asked whether she was aware that those memos described a coordinated strategy for generating abandonment designations on specific targeted parcels. The word targeted was one he placed deliberately, and he watched it land. The composure held, but the effort required to hold it increased visibly. She told him that the community would not forget how he was choosing to handle this, that people were watching, that his family's legacy in the valley would be defined by this moment. Ethan said he was counting on people watching. He said the specific quality of what they were watching would likely matter quite a bit in the next few weeks. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she got back in her car and drove down the gravel path and out through the gate that was still chained with the combination lock that Ethan had not yet bothered to remove. He watched her taillights disappear into the fog. He knew what the next step was. She would call a meeting. The Sterling Heights HOA held its emergency session at the community clubhouse 3 days later on a Thursday evening when the rain had paused and the valley was left with the cold, cleared air stillness that follows a sustained storm. The parking lot outside the clubhouse was full. Ethan counted 31 cars and recognized approximately half of them. He went in and took a seat in the back, which was not where Victoria wanted him, and which was also exactly where he intended to be. She began with a prepared presentation slides on a screen behind her, the same polished visual language as the brochure. The lake, in that impossible blue, the villa renderings, the marina, the transit corridor shown as a clean line connecting the valley to a regional highway. She spoke about the project's timeline. She spoke about investment commitments already made. She spoke about the community benefits that would flow to current residents in the form of increased property values and shared amenities. She spoke for 9 minutes without being interrupted, and she did it well. And then the questions started. A man in his 50s, near the front, someone Ethan knew vaguely as a third-generation Valley resident whose family had been there nearly as long as the Carters, raised his hand and asked why the project's insurance underwriting had been frozen. Victoria said there was a temporary administrative review in process. A woman near the window asked whether the Eastern Land Corridor had received formal easement approval. Victoria said the easements were in the process of being finalized. The man near the front asked what finalized meant exactly, given that the project was allegedly past the point of no return. The woman near the window asked whether the current ownership of the Carter parcel had been confirmed by a licensed surveyor within the past 12 months. Victoria said these were all excellent questions that would be addressed in detail through the appropriate process. Ethan stood up. He said he could answer several of those questions directly, since he was the current owner of the Carter parcel and had not been consulted about any easement corridor designation, abandonment filing, or land use agreement in connection with the Sterling Heights project. He said he had documentation if anyone wanted to review it. He said the corridor that the entire transit component of the project depended on ran across Carter family land at 2 specific crossing points that could not be rerouted without making the project economically non-viable, and that no authorization for those crossings had ever been sought from the Carter family because the project's planners had proceeded on the assumption that the family had abandoned the land. He said that assumption had been wrong. He sat back down. The room did something rooms rarely do, which is go completely uniformly quiet, not the quiet of shock, but the quiet of arithmetic, of people doing fast and unhappy math in their heads. Victoria said she appreciated his input and that there were processes in place to address these concerns. She was still standing, but the room had shifted. Nobody in it looked at her the way they had looked at her 14 minutes ago. The door at the back of the clubhouse opened. Sheriff Mason Cole came in first, and the particular quality of his presence unhurried, public unambiguous about its own significance, made the room shift again in a different direction. Behind him came a woman Ethan had not met before who introduced herself as Rebecca Turner from the County Land Records Office. She was carrying a cardboard tube of the kind used for architectural drawings, and she set it on the table at the front of the room and unrolled the contents without ceremony. It was a survey map drawn to a large scale covering the valley from the ridge to the lakeshore and from the eastern boundary to the western access road. The boundaries were marked in red. The proposed transit corridor was overlaid in blue. The areas of intersection, the 2 crossing points that Ethan had described, were circled in black. Every person in the room who had spent more than a year in Eagle Creek Valley could read a survey map, and every person in that room could see what the map showed. Rebecca Turner said the county's position was that the project's transit corridor, as currently designed and approved, crossed Carter family land at both critical junctures, and that the county had not received any documentation of an authorized easement or land use agreement for either crossing. She said the county was recommending an immediate suspension of all project activities pending a full title review. She said without looking up from the map that her office had been aware of internal concerns about the abandonment designation process for several months, and that a formal review of those designations had been initiated 3 weeks prior. She said the outcome of that review was not expected to support the designations as issued. The room was very quiet again. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the map. Whatever she was seeing in it, it was not the blue lake from the brochures. The investigation that followed moved the way institutional investigations move methodically with a bureaucratic thoroughness that produced its results in increments rather than revelations. Within 2 weeks, the internal email archive of the Sterling Heights Development Group had been subpoenaed in connection with the title review. Within 3 weeks, the content of those emails was no longer confidential, and what it demonstrated was a level of prior knowledge that made Victoria Sterling's claims of good faith reliance on county assessments difficult to sustain as a legal position. The emails showed that the transit corridor's dependence on Carter land had been identified by the project's own engineers in the early planning phase 17 months before Ethan's return. They showed that a strategy for addressing this dependency through the abandonment designation process had been discussed explicitly in writing by at least 3 members of the development team. They showed that Victoria Sterling had been on the distribution list for those discussions and had responded to them. The investment group that had been Victoria's primary financial partner issued a statement announcing a pause in all project activities pending legal clarification. The pause was the kind that experienced observers recognize as permanent. 2 other investors withdrew publicly within the following week. The HOA board held a special session at which Victoria's position as community development chair was formally suspended, pending the completion of the county's review. The man who had asked about the insurance underwriting at the emergency meeting sent Ethan a brief message through a mutual contact, 3 sentences, saying he was sorry for not asking sooner and that he had been given information that he now understood to have been carefully curated. The title hearing was held in the county courthouse on a gray Tuesday morning in late January, with a light sleet coming down outside the tall windows and pooling in the gutters of the old stone building. The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television, paneled in a wood that had been refinished enough times to have lost whatever character it once had, with rows of hard benches and a flag that stood at a slight angle and had clearly been standing at that same angle for years without anyone deciding whether to straighten it. The judge was a methodical man who read the survey documents and the deed records and the assessment timeline with a patience that suggested he had spent a career distinguishing between what paperwork said and what it meant. There were no dramatic moments. This was the consistent surprise of legal proceedings for people who had never sat through one, that the resolution of things that had felt enormous and contested and personally consequential could take place in a room this quiet, with this little theater. The participants speaking in measured voices about documents and dates and recorded instruments of conveyance while the sleet tapped against the windows and a heating unit somewhere in the building worked steadily against the cold. Ethan's attorney presented the Carter family chain of title unbroken from the original deed in 1951 through the current trust documentation. She presented the survey confirming the 2 corridor crossing points. She presented the county's own internal memos documenting the abandonment designation strategy. She presented the email correspondence. The judge read everything. He asked 3 questions, all of which had clear answers. He issued his finding the Carter Family Trust held valid, uncontested title to the parcel in question, including both corridor crossing points. The abandonment designation was voided. The easement claims were dismissed. The county's property records were to be corrected accordingly within 30 days. Victoria Sterling was not in the courtroom. She had submitted a written statement through her attorney and had not appeared in person, which was perhaps the first time since Ethan had returned to the valley that she had declined to occupy a room she might otherwise have controlled. He drove back to Eagle Creek Valley through the sleet, which had thickened into something closer to real snow by the time he reached the pass, the flakes large and soft in the headlights. The kind of snowfall that sticks to everything, to branches, to fence rails, to the rooftops of lodges that have been standing since the early 1950s. He came through the gate, which he had replaced with a simple wooden bar that lifted with one hand the way his grandfather's gate had worked. He parked and sat in the truck for a moment, listening to the snow fall on the roof of the cab, which produced almost no sound at all, but was somehow entirely audible. The lodge looked the way the lodge had always looked in snowfall-rooted dents, a structure that had been built to belong to this particular piece of land and had spent 70 years confirming the judgment. The lantern by the front door was dark. He had noticed the wiring was corroded when he first came back. He had been meaning to fix it. Samuel Reed called the following morning, and his voice had the specific quality of someone delivering news they have been waiting to deliver. Victoria Sterling had tendered her resignation from all HOA positions the previous afternoon, effective immediately. The development group's legal team had filed a notice of formal dispute against 3 members of the planning department's assessor division. The reservoir expansion project, the federal infrastructure approval that had made Eagle Creek Valley land so consequential in the first place, was moving forward on its original timeline, which meant that the watershed value of the valley was going to continue increasing, regardless of what happened to the now-frozen resort project. Samuel said the county assessor's office was reviewing a total of 11 abandonment designations that had been issued over the same period, using similar procedural patterns. He said Ethan's title documentation had been useful to that review in ways that went beyond his own situation. Ethan thanked him. Samuel said he had been waiting 14 months to make that phone call and that he was genuinely glad Ethan had come back when he did. The days after the hearing had a different quality, not peaceful exactly. There were still phone calls from attorneys, still follow-up requests from the county, still the practical work of undoing what had been done to the property over the months of its supposed stewardship. The combination lock was gone from the gate. The contractor's stakes that had been driven into the south meadow were pulled and the holes filled. The laminated notices were removed from every post and fence where they had been attached, leaving behind small circles of weathered wood, slightly lighter than the surrounding surface, the ghost of each zip tie and fastener. Ethan replaced the wiring on the lantern by the front door. It was an afternoon's work, the kind of specific tangible task that returns a person to a space that has been temporarily claimed by someone else. When he switched it on at dusk and it came on cleanly, the warm amber of the old incandescent globe falling across the porch boards and the stone step, he stood in the doorway and watched it for longer than the task required. People came by in the ways that people in small communities come by when they are apologizing without wanting to use the word, with extra firewood, with food, with information delivered as casual conversation. Gerald from the diner walked up the path on a Saturday morning with coffee in a thermos and stood on the porch and said without preamble that he wished he had said something sooner. He said he had not known the full extent of what Victoria was doing, but that he had known enough to be uncomfortable and that he had made a choice to stay quiet that he was not proud of. Ethan poured a cup from the thermos and handed it back to him and said he understood the position. Gerald held the thermos and looked at the lake, which was visible again that morning, the fog having lifted overnight, the water, its actual winter color, the cold steel gray that people who had grown up near it found more honest than any artistic rendering. The man who had given Ethan the warning at the diner, the property consultant, sent a formal message through an intermediary saying that he had been operating on information provided by the development group and that he had since learned the nature of that information and was cooperating with the county's review. The woman in the gray blazer from the lodge showing reached out directly through his attorney. She had her message indicated withdrawn from the project several days before the emergency HOA meeting. She said she had seen enough to have her own questions. Samuel called again in late February to say that the county had formally closed the abandonment designation review and that the results had been referred to the district attorney's office. He said he expected the referral to produce civil consequences at minimum. He said the reservoir expansion approval was being publicly announced the following week and that the resulting increase in watershed-adjacent property values was going to be significant. He said Eagle Creek Valley was going to be in the regional news for the next several months, probably, and that Ethan should be prepared for that. Ethan said he appreciated the warning. He looked out the window at the valley at Silver Pine Lake in the late winter light, the ridge still carrying snow on its north-facing slopes, the meadow below the lodge beginning to show the first pale green underneath the dead grass, the way it did every year. The annual argument for continuity and patience and the quiet durability of things that had been built to last. He had been thinking about what to do with the land. Not selling that had never been part of any version of the thinking, not even in the abstract, not even in the hardest weeks. But there were options that his grandfather had considered once long ago that involved conservation easements and public access agreements that kept the land intact and protected it from exactly the kind of use it had just been threatened with, and that made its protection a matter of public record rather than just private intention. He had calls to make. He had documents to review. He had time, which was the thing that Victoria Sterling's plan had always depended on him not having, and which turned out to be the one resource she had never been able to acquire or manufacture or designate as abandoned. He fixed the fence near the old post, the 45-degree lean the gap his cousin had created with a truck bumper years ago, and no one had gotten around to closing. He dug out the post with a bar and reset it in concrete on a gray afternoon with light rain coming in off the ridge, the kind of work that is mostly standing in one place and waiting for the thing you've done to become permanent. There was a satisfaction to it that had nothing to do with the dispute or the hearing or the voided designation. It was the simpler satisfaction of a thing broken becoming a thing repaired, of a boundary restored to the line it had always occupied on paper and should always occupy in fact. He worked until the light went, and then stood with the bar over his shoulder and watched the concrete set in the rain, the new post straight and solid in the ground, while the old one lay in the grass beside the trench. A hawk moved over the south meadow low and hunting, banking once along the tree line before disappearing over the ridge. When Ethan was finished, he walked the property line from the east boundary to the western access road and back the way his grandfather had walked it, the way his father had walked it, the way he had walked it as a kid in the summers, when the valley was green and the lake was warm enough to swim in, and Eagle Creek itself ran clear and fast over the rocks near the lower meadow. The land was the same ridge, the same lake, the same creek, the same stand of Douglas firs on the north slope that had been old when the lodge was new, the same cold air, the same particular quality of silence that existed in this valley, and as far as Ethan had ever found, nowhere else. He had been many places in 9 hours of driving. He was here now. The lantern by the front door was on, too. Victoria Sterling had come to Eagle Creek Valley looking for a piece of land she could use. She had found instead what the land actually was: not a parcel, not a corridor, not a line item in a development budget, but the foundational fact of everything she had been trying to build. She had read the Carter family's absence as abandonment. She had read silence as concession. She had read the gap in the fence as an invitation. She had prepared for every outcome except the one where the person who owned the valley came back and knew exactly what he owned. The lodge had stood for more than 70 years on ground that had been surveyed and deeded and maintained and passed down through a family with the particular quiet stubbornness of people who understood that some things are not assets to be deployed, but truths to be kept. It had outlasted logging operations, outlasted 2 recessions, outlasted 3 separate county rezoning proposals that had each in their turn treated the valley as a blank space waiting to be filled with someone else's vision. The Carter family had not treated it that way. They had treated it as a place that already had a purpose, that had been a place before anyone arrived to develop it, and that would continue to be a place long after any particular plan for it had dissolved into the legal record alongside all the other plans that had dissolved before. Ethan understood this not as ideology, but as simple fact, the way you understand the weight of a thing you have carried long enough that the weight is no longer separate from you. Victoria Sterling had thought she was taking a cabin. She had not understood until it was too late to do anything useful with the understanding that the cabin was not the thing. Eagle Creek Valley, in its entirety, the lake shore and the meadow and the creek and the eastern corridor and the north slope and the south meadow and the fence line, and the old Douglas firs and the gate that lifted with one hand, was the thing and always had been, and the Carter family had not built it or purchased it or inherited it in order to eventually let it go. The lantern by the front door was on, and the fog was moving through the pines below the lodge the same way it always moved, and the lake was the actual color of winter water, and the valley held its cold and patient silence around all of it, as it had since long before anyone had thought to put a price on it.